welcome back to another episode of REDtalks.live. I am your host, Nathan Pierce, and today I have Michael Fraser from refactr. How are you doing, Michael?
Great. Thanks, Nathan, for having me.
Fantastic. And we're going to talk about something that I think doesn't get talked about enough, which is DevSecOps. And in my personal experience, maybe not as much recently, but go back 4 or 5 years ago, anytime automation was brought up, the security people often weren't even invited because they slowed the project down because the right tools weren't there, the right processes, the accessibility to deliver wasn't around. And that, I believe, if I've got it right, Michael, is what you're set out to kind of solve. And that's what refactr is all about. Did I get that summarized pretty well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I go back. I'm a cybersecurity engineer in the Air Force, so I've seen kind of the progress, the public cloud becoming a thing even before that, the virtualization in the private cloud, and over, I'd say, probably the last 15 years or so, and really the last 10 around cloud, organizations really trying to figure out how to incorporate secure, or if they can, security into the automation process. But if we have to kind of rewind back to 2009 timeframe when DevOps became a thing, but really the DevOps was called agile infrastructure at the very beginning, and it was really a way to add infrastructure into software delivery. But to your point, it was all about agility. It was all about how quick can we get releases out, how quickly can we get new working code out and updated to end users. And so security was always something that was a reactive thing, came in after the fact or looked at things, and so it wasn't a part of the overall process. And now that everything's becoming software defined, and as I like to call it, everything's becoming IT as code, there has to be a way to be able to get everything that we do into an agile approach, and it not just for software delivery. And so I look at DevSecOps as really being, it's not AppSec changed into DevSecOps. It's really this holistic view of every single team, DevSec and Ops, need to be able to be working together to build automation for an organization, to create the agility, or increase the agility of the overall organization, and to include every technical team a part of that process. Because if you exclude somebody or they're working in their own silo, it always becomes an issue where, if you want to bolt them on after the fact, it decreases not only the agility, but it stops forward momentum. And then also it causes a bottleneck because you have a team out there. And I've seen this is one of the reasons why I started building what I am doing now is, I'd go out there as a cloud security architect and build stuff for organizations and different tools out there like Terraform and Ansible and so on. But what I'd find is the customer that I'm working with, whether it's a security team or IT team or even a DevOps team, a lot of times they may not know some of the tools or how to chain them together or structure things to be able to make more sophisticated automation, because they would look at it as like, oh, well, I have my tools, I run my stuff, I like to call it manual automation, right? Where I'm doing automation, but I'm running things from a command line, which is, fine for a small team. But all of a sudden, when you're trying to scale things out or you're trying to enroll other people from a collaborative standpoint, how do you enroll other people in, being able to leverage the content that you're creating as a cloud security architect or a DevOps engineer or DevSecOps engineer, and not be the bottleneck where it's like, okay, well, I'll get to what you're asking me, but it may be a few dev cycles, and I'm the one who has to be able to do it for you, not trying to maybe hand something off to you in a format you can use. And what I found, especially when it comes to ops and security, is that they really need something that's catered to them. And so it needs to be something that, is visually focused. I'm an anomaly. I started out on the ops side and came over to the software engineering side, right? And so usually that doesn't happen, right? Unless you understand that you have to start learning new technologies and new things to continue to stay relevant, because of the fact that if I abstract away all the hardware and I now have everything that's software defined, if I'm going to be able to work with those that have been, building software defined, infrastructure as code and other things, I have to at least know the tools and the fundamentals of how that stuff works so that I can then be able to be a part of that process. But if I'm just coming in it with like no basis of understanding of even simple stuff like what is Git, what is infrastructure as code, What is what's declarative? What's immutable? What's all of these things that you hear these terms out there, like, how does this apply to me, and how can I stay relevant? And I'm talking about, generally talking about ops and security folks, where they have to modernize what they're doing as the organization is modernizing, so that, again, everybody could be a part of this process, because that's really critical for us to really achieve this future state of what DevSecOps is really meant to be, which isn't just about automation. It's about a complete culture change and mentality and mindset of how we go about doing things, and really increasing the overall agility of the organization.
I feel it's kind of telling, just the fact that there's a DevSecOps term, that I mean, DevOps accelerated down a path and then found these other areas like the networking flavor. I mean, what's Cisco's DevOps? Because oh, hang on, we didn't do any of that network stuff. So okay, and then DevSecOps, and I mean, yes, if you're doing DevOps right, you leave no ops behind. But I think what we often see when a new thing is adopted, for a lot of organizations, they build pure cloud. They don't have anything legacy to manage, so they don't have any of the older technologies to bring along, and they just rely on whatever that cloud provider is offering, and they think, that's my security, tick, done. But then you've got all these other organizations, all the blue chip organizations that are make billions of dollars. They don't have the luxury of doing that. They look at automation and they're like, well, unless it's including networking and security, and unless I can bake all of it into my new infrastructure as code strategy, then I can't do any of it. And did you see, like, before DevSecOps got momentum, like entire projects just stall or even die because it couldn't do the whole thing end to end, like it wasn't inclusive enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And also trying to figure out how much, I think a lot of times organizations get mired in, we want to automate every last possible thing. And so I always come in at, like, try to aim for a certain percentage. Like, everything may not be able to be automated, especially to your point, if it's not all cloud native and it's not everything that I can actually build within tools, or there's an easy path forward in order to be able to build what I need to make it end to end. And then the other piece of it, to your point about, adding in security, or just generally, is like, a lot of these security vendors and a lot of the tools out there really weren't made to be able to have them a part of an automation process. If you go ask anybody that's like a Cisco partner, they'd be like, yeah, there's some products that still we cannot access, there's not great APIs for the ability to do things programmatically. There's not a lot of automation content out there for these particular things we're trying to do. And it's a pervasive issue across a lot of different, especially in security, cybersecurity vendors. And so, in 2020, it's starting to get better, but I still hear grumblings from a lot of organizations. They're like, hey, I need to support this particular firewall and this particular cloud provider, and I want to add that into, a Kubernetes implementation, and I want to do this benchmark to it, and so on. So they understand, like, there's pieces and parts that they want to be able to build out and automate, but then they go in and realize, oh, wait a minute, there's like 10 different steps that I have to do manually before I would even start automating this. And maybe it's easy for me just to continue to do these manually. And so I think that one of the things that I constantly push out there is that vendors really have to get on board with understanding the need of organizations and why they want to automate, and continue, if they're already building automation content out there and open source tools, that's awesome, but continuing to also think about how those products work with other vendors, because integration points and trying to build these more sophisticated automation pipelines in general, just as people are getting to this future state of everything becoming software defined or IT as code, is really a place where vendors have to help as well, because you can only do so much, that you're going to build out until you get to the point where you're like, oh, there's these 10 different things I'm trying to automate now in this particular product, and there's nothing available for me to do that, or I can't do that. And that's, to your point about being end to end, that's where I see a lot of organizations going, well, I can't get everything I wanted to be automated, so I feel like I failed here. And really what it comes down to is expectations, and realizing that you may need to scale back and figure out, okay, well, if I can automate 60% of that, what is the increase in my efficiencies that I've created here? And am I also enabling my existing talent to be able to do more and be able to realize, more for the organization, as everybody's trying to do this thing called digital transformation, which I just kind of think it as being something that's, that is again, back to the agility of the organization. How quickly can I add in new products? How quickly can I do things that are going to help the end users of the organization, so that it's not something that takes a ton of planning on the front end. And then 2 years later, it's like, oh, I finally got that product or tool that I really needed to use.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I'm going to link that statement back to something you
Yes.
said a little earlier about many of the vendors, and you were right to call out both security and networking, where they clearly weren't architected for automation. And many of them reacted quickly and slapped an API on the front of their internal object model that really wasn't ever designed API first. Like, you can just tell when you interact with it. It's like, wait, why is that item potent and that bit isn't, and this bit I've got to read to tell that? And you can just tell it's a lacquer of API over a CLI. And I think that's common for many. And then going to market saying it's RESTful, it's kind of RESTful. And then people who are familiar with automation tools and products and pipelines start trying to use it. And it's like, wow, I'm going to have to block a few weeks out to just mess with this API now and see what it does, because it's unpredictable and I'm a little scared of it. And I think that even people who know a little bit about automation are going to get put off by some of those things, because it is a little intimidating where this product behaves this way, that one behaves that way. They're all saying that they've got RESTful APIs, bits of them are. Like, and I guess we're leading on to kind of what you've done and what kind of refactor's all about, really, aren't we? Like stitching some of this together and kind of abstracting and obscuring some of the craziness.
Yeah, for sure. And it comes down also to, like, a lot of the tools that are out there just generally, right? So like the Terraforms and the Ansibles of the world, they've done a good job of trying to abstract away, or, having to write your underlying code, right? And so I can now use, a module, an Ansible, or a provider in Terraform, which are awesome and really, cool to do. But as soon as I start wanting to get more complicated, or I start wanting to chain tools together, because as we all know, there's some tools that do infrastructure as code really well. There's some that do configuration management. There's some that do network automation. There's some that do, API stuff, or maybe I want to write my own custom code. And so the question is, how do I get all of these different tools working together in my tool chain? Because most people out there, unless you're an actual pure DevOps engineer, aren't used to chaining tools together. Again, to my point earlier, you may use something like Ansible, but you're probably running commands on the command line. You're not chaining Ansible or building it onto workflows. You may use something like Ansible Tower, but again, it's one tool. And so now what do I do for infrastructure as code? And never answer, I do that with Ansible too, because I've heard people say that, and you can, but there's always a better tool for the different things that you're doing. And so, if you're going to incorporate like cloud native templates or Terraform, the overall goal is now I need to link these things together, and I need to look at it more like I want to build out pipelining, right? So I want to build out a sequence of steps that I'm going to go do something, and I want to do it in a way that's not just about software delivery. I want to be able to apply it onto anything that I'm trying to do, whether it's some small things of automation. Maybe there's some security automation where I want to do a few different tasks. Maybe it is some infrastructure and I want to have some, and this is where the security part comes in, where I want to have the ability to have tools incorporated in to that process too. So I may want to do like a vulnerability scan with an open source tool like OpenSCAP. I may want to use a paid tool like Syscat Assessor from CIS. So then we start thinking about, okay, well now how do I combine not just the tools together, but now I package these up into these pipelines. And now I want to have these pipelines where I can tie them together too. Because again, I may have an infrastructure one where I build out base infrastructure. I have another one where I may want to actually configure the infrastructure. I have another one I may want to run some assessments against it. And so essentially what we've done at Refactor, and this is the problem that we've seen out there, is being able to provide a platform that caters to a larger technical audience, so that on the front end of it, you can have the ops and the security folks be able to come into more of a low-code approach, where they look at things from a UI and a GUI and a wizard, a perspective where that they're already used to living in all the tools that they currently use. And so being able to use something that's visual on the front end to go and build and design pipelines, but the back end of it is still what the DevOps and the cloud security architects, the cloud architects are all looking at. It's like, hey, I still want my YAML definition. I still want to use all these tools that are supported natively. So if I want to run Terraform, I better be able to run Terraform natively as a Terraform configuration, right? I better be able to run Ansible as a playbook. I better be able to run cloud native templates. And then the value of the other things like other tools you support like OpenSCAP, and some other stuff we're adding from like CIS, Syscat, and even some other tools like Kubernetes stuff and so on, kind of moving towards more cloud native, but still providing all the ability to do all the stuff that you would want to do traditionally from traditional infrastructure. Because to your point earlier, there's really not a lot of large organizations that are pure cloud native. And there are also a lot that are multi-cloud because they've realized, oh, okay, some of these services are better in this cloud, some of them are better in this cloud. And so how do I chain those all together? So essentially, we built a platform to enable the collaboration of being able to build content within these tools, all supported in their native format, and then be able to execute them in the same backend environment as the people that are building the content. And even if you're just coming in and running it or doing some tweaking, you're still running it in the same format so that everybody is a part of the iterative agile life cycle of whatever you're working within. So that way you have the ability to have more people coming in and automating at whatever level they're at and whatever they feel more comfortable, whether they're living in the code or they want to live on the visual side. They have the best of both worlds. And usually one of those gets sacrificed, right? You either have a super powerful CI/CD platform, but it's really catered for developers, or you have a low code or no code platform that pretty much chops out any kind of ability to do anything complicated beyond what it provides to you.
That's cool, man. Yeah, the preaching to the converted. Yeah, I can't resonate a lot enough. And in the time we got left, I'd love to hear just about like how Refactr got started, like your journey. I mean, you were the person running around solving this for people as like the engineer, and then I mean, obviously your ability to scale is one at that point. So
yeah,
you've kind of broadened past that, and that's how Refactr started. So tell us a little bit of that backstory. Like, where'd it come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started out my career in the Air Force as a cybersecurity engineer, and I've been a practitioner / entrepreneur. So I've had multiple different companies, starting out in the cloud, doing private cloud back before it was called the hyperconverged infrastructure, like 10 years ago. And even at that time, I was looking at like, all right, what tools can we use to try to automate the deployments we're doing? How can we put everything together? And that was back in the days of Cloud Stack, and OpenStack was just becoming a thing. So I was super in love with cloud management platforms and how you could deploy them on-premise for customers and being able to, but you realize like there's a lot to it, the hardware component and so on. So it was very hard. And we templated it out, but it's one of those things where we're just like, okay, well, things need to evolve and mature before we can really get to a place where we can automate an entire build of everything we want to do in a way that's also cost effective. Because back then there wasn't a whole lot of open source tools other than, like the cloud management platforms, but or you built your own stuff, right? So there's a high level of development requirement that you had to put into it. And so a few years ago, decided that, I was building out clouds for, tech companies and, from the ground up, everything that they needed for them and building within the tools that existed out there, and found that, to your point, like I myself wasn't scalable. And what's the process in any organization or any consultant or anybody out there that's, building in these tools? They hand off a Git repo. They maybe have a working, setup of what they've actually built out there for the customer. But what happens 6 months down the road? What happens a year down the road? How do they understand not only what they got, but if I want to bring somebody else in, like, how do I start them off without something that they understand or at least can see what's happening here, other than, the other answer to that is, hey, we can build out a bunch of diagrams in Visio or Lucidchart and, do a bunch of documentation and so on. But it still comes down to like, it's very difficult to try to communicate something like that to your customer in a way that not only they can somewhat understand, but also they themselves can be a part of, working and building and iterating on things too. And so really about three years ago, we started developing Refactr, but even rewinding a little bit before that, I was super heavy in virtual desktop world. And it's actually funny because I don't know if you saw NetApp bought CloudJumper, and I heard NetApp saying, hey, it's 2020 is the year of VDI, and I laughed, and I sent a bunch of my employees an article I wrote for Redmond Channel Partners back in 2014 saying Microsoft needs to change how they license Windows desktop, or nobody's going to embrace it in the cloud. Obviously, that's changed, but the overall point there is, before I did this, we were building a workspace as a service offering, doing Citrix and RDS, secure desktops in Azure and AWS, and even GCP or Google Cloud. And the goal was that we wanted to completely orchestrate end-to-end the build, but we were building our own custom templates in that platform. And what we found was that underneath all the tools we were using and everything else that we were doing, that people wanted to be able to apply that to anything they were building. And so we were like, oh, okay, well, this isn't really something that should just only be ops focused, but this shouldn't also be something that's only dev focused. And then let's not leave out the cybersecurity folks, because they want to be in on this too. So how do we figure out how to build something that not only caters to everybody? And I'll say, as we've moved along this journey building this platform, we just end of life our first version of the platform, and we learned a lot. I think we've done 2 major pivots on how we went about doing things, not just on the target focus of the customer, but also realizing this problem is bigger than what we thought it was at the very beginning, and trying to focus in on what we're currently doing now, which is really around making sure that we have all the tools that people want to support now, but having a pluggable framework to continue to add tools, open source and open tools that add value, and then also adding value to vendors that have content they've already built, but they're really having a problem being able to get that content into a format that their target customers can use. And so we're looking at that as being another problem that we're solving, because a lot of those folks, like I mentioned earlier, are ops and security folks that aren't, and even some of these vendors, cybersecurity vendors, they have like one guy who builds most of the content, or maybe 1 or 2 people. And you think about that in a company of thousands and thousands of employees. So that problem persists in any customer they have, mid-size enterprise, and even up to like the stuff they're doing with the DoD. So we're actually working with the Air Force. We got an AppWorks SIBR phase 1 for our platform. We're working with their DevSecOps initiative through Level Up, which is essentially the initiative inside of the Air Force that's spearheading this DevSecOps initiative. And it's really awesome to see that the DoD is on board with this. I even told them, it's like, hey, look, if you had this initiative back when I was still active duty, I may have stayed in a little bit longer, or I may have been a civilian, or I may have been something else. But I said, at this point in time, it's awesome because I'm back working with the Air Force, doing something super cool and innovative with them, and seeing them really being receptive to trying to fast track innovative companies to bring in, where I remember when I was in, it was almost impossible to come in to be able to bring any sort of technology in unless you went through some really arduous process. And if it's anything like what's happening now that they're doing with containers and different flavors of Kubernetes and building everything modular and releasing things like even ahead of a lot of commercial customers, that was unheard of, 10 years ago when I left the Air Force.
That's cool, man. Yeah. So, well, I can't think of anyone who doesn't need someone helping with that, stitching elements of security in the pipeline together, because I got to say the majority of the work I've done over the last at least 8 years has been spent looking at ways of getting one technology's output to feed another, and nothing ever mashes up. It's like linking Lego with Meccano. Both cool on their own, but there just is no, and I should have used that analogy before. So
That's a pretty good one. Yeah,
that is exactly the problem, though, that basically anyone building pipelines is doing, and that's why we've seen it in silos, like the developer tooling, dev focused kind of pipeline tools. That's brilliantly simple for developer tooling and what they're doing, but the moment that has to step out and work with something else, it gets tricky.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't think about to your point, the integration points, or even how I'm going to hand data off from one step to another, right? So that's, so even when we were architecting out our platform, it was really about, okay, if I'm gonna run some automation against some external systems, I'm gonna get some results back from those external systems, right? Some responses. I'm gonna have those that I can then take that data out and pop them in somewhere else, you would think that that's fairly trivial and every system should support it. But that's not the case in a lot of systems where it's like actually trying to chain multiple set sequences of automation together goes beyond even what a lot of the CI/CD platforms were really made for, because they're looking at just like, hey, I have a build process. I want to get this thing released out. I may want to incorporate some infrastructure, but that's what I do. That's what the platform does. Now all of a sudden you want to bring in security products or other things where you're like, okay, well, I need an image here. I need to be able, I need some core infrastructure. I need to be able to configure that thing. I may want to come in after the fact and run some, simple automation tasks against that. I don't want to pay for a SOAR product because that's way too expensive. I only need to do these 10 tasks against that. So what do? Can I use the CI/CD platform that's out there? And that's always like the conundrum. Like people think of CI/CD as like only dev too. Like, and that's where I'm like totally adamant that this problem is not only bigger than dev, it's really what we've all been trying to figure out how to get to. And the only way to get to this future approach to where we're trying to get with things, or even trying to do it now, is everything has to be software defined, because if it's not, then I can't put it into some sort of process to be able to not only get the end result of the outcome I'm looking for whatever I'm doing, but also have an iterative process. And even things like you brought up, like idempotency or being idempotent, things like that, where you're not thinking about it if you're just running something one-off, but all of a sudden if you try to run something over and over again, you're like, oh, yeah, I need to actually think about those things because I want to have the agility to go do things, but I also want to catastrophically cause issues to things I'm trying to automate as well.
And what you're explaining, that's why when you hear CI/CD, there's two different versions. There's continuous deployment and continuous delivery. And for many, continuous delivery is the reality because they can't hand off creation of the artifacts to production deployment because of all these tools that were never designed to be a part of the end of that pipeline. So a lot of people, when they're building out CI/CD pipelines, their dream can only be realized as far as the delivery of the artifacts to go into production, not the deployment. And with companies like yourself enabling the stitching together of the rest of the pipeline, like as you say on your website, drastically simplifying DevSecOps automation, it's only with things like that that I can realize that rest of the system that I need in place to get to a deployment automation. So that's cool stuff, man.
Yeah, and I just on that point, I would say also, like, think about any of the security tools that you want to just use in general, right? So then you look at the tool and go, something like OpenSCAP, for instance, right? A lot of organizations use it to be able to scan and get assessments against different types of benchmarks, STIG and CIS and so on. But the problem with every open source tool out there is that it has a community. No, I say the problem. It's awesome that there's communities behind it, but it's also then it's on you to be able to utilize that tool. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is, like, open source by itself monetarily is free, right? But there is a cost to everything. Yeah, there is a cost to everything. So how much time and effort are you going to have to put into these free open source tools? And I'm not saying, like, I'm a huge proponent of open source, but at the same time, you have to be realistic and quantify the overall cost to you and how much time it's going to take to get up to speed and what it's going to take for you to actually build things out. And just because it's free doesn't mean it's actually free. There's a cost in labor and other things to it. And then also, it's really about, there's a lot of people out there like, hey, I'm pure open source. It's all I do. And I'm like, it's really a balance. Like, there are some commercial products out there that are awesome for what they do. And the amount of effort it's going to take you to be able to get something that's open source on par with you being able to use the commercial product may be night and day. And so you really need to analyze that. And also, how much time and effort and training and ongoing maintenance of what you're trying to do takes, where sometimes it's better to offload it to the commercial vendor. So I look at it as a balance of, like, pick and choose wisely between the open source tools you want to use and the third party or commercial paid tools you want to use, because it's really not going to ever skew one way or another. I would never say use all commercial or use all open source. Try to figure out some sort of balance between the two.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. So we're almost at time for today. I really appreciate your time. I mean, great to hear about someone's out there solving DevSecOps automation. Because as I often say, leave no ops behind. That is the path to success. So maybe we can get another session on the calendar with a bit of a deep dive and actually look at some of the technology at a later date. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'm totally game for that.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, just come to REDtalks.live. Well, I think we're on pretty much every platform. You can get me on LinkedIn, the website, via the mailing list. You choose. Love to hear your feedback. If you want to see a demonstration, yeah, do let us know, and we'll prioritize that. But yeah, again, thanks for your time, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate coming today and talking about all things DevSecOps. It's been fun.
Indeed. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks.